Hi there. Today I'd like to talk about our wonderful president and some of the origins of why the whole climate change issue became so apocalyptic. So first let me say something about our president. One of the things I've learned, and probably a lot of you have as well, is that you've got to pick your battles. So there's always a lot that I'd like the president to do, particularly pertaining to draining the swamp regarding climate change. But you can't do everything. You've got to decide what you're going to focus on and what you're going to do so you can get things done. So you may say, oh, I want him to, cut the budget, I want him to do this or that, but sometimes he can't do it right away. And maybe he can't ever get to it. So if he's going to be effective, he has to pick his battles. Having said that, one of the many, many things I like about our president is that he does a lot of what I would call the under the radar actions that don't get a lot of press and sometimes get almost no press at all, but they're doing great things for our country, for our economy, that are just fabulous. Okay, so in this instance, I have one kind of big example and one small example. One I thought was really under the radar, but then there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that talked about it. But basically it says, Trump moves to speed infrastructure projects by curbing environmental reviews. Now, for those of you who've been following that, these environmental reviews have gotten so long, so cumbersome. There's a whole cottage industry of people that do these reports, and they don't really accomplish anything other than delay and make more expensive a project. So I first read about it in What's Up With That. That's a great watts, 100-watt light bulb. That's a really good site for good climate-related information. All of it in the debunking sense. So just to sum up what Donald Trump has done in this, it's the proposed changes to the 50-year-old National Environmental Policy Act. Now, it's not that these were written into the law. These are ways in which various agencies interpret this because a law is more vague. So it could sharply reduce obstacles to something like the Keystone XL oil pipeline and other fossil fuel projects that have been stymied when courts ruled that the Trump administration did not properly consider climate change when analyzing the environmental effects of the projects. So what the administration has done is it says we're going to narrow the range of projects that require environmental review. Okay, how can you look at a project, a pipeline, and say, how does that contribute to climate change? It's just ridiculous. It just slows it down, makes it more expensive, and a whole bunch of people make money, lawyers. I've read some of those reports because I'm on the Santa Monica Canyon Civic Association board, and it's just like, what does this do, really? Someone on our board picked up some little part of it and wanted to object, and it was like nothing. So I got him to back off on that, my little contribution to the Santa Monica Canyon Civic Association. But this is really good. This is really good. I'm trying to find where, but in it, President Trump talked about how quickly we used to be able to do projects. It was amazing how fast we built the the Empire State Building, how, there's just a whole bunch of stuff. It used to just take a couple years, and now it takes decades sometimes, and the interesting thing is, which is funny, is even some of the environmental, I shouldn't say environmental, but projects favored by the Greens, like, building a solar farm or whatever, there's still a lot of things you have to go through that have had nothing to do with the project. Another thing was like when we had the drought in California, I was very much in favor of building desalination plants, because now when we have a lot of rain, it's not a problem, but it's silly to not have access to water, because in Israel, they fixed their problem basically, both by recycling water, which you can do, and we do some of that in LA, but we should have desalination plants. When you get a lot of water from rain, doesn't help. But, you know, of course you have to have reservoirs, but what if we get to a point, like in the 1100s, the year, there was like a 200-year drought in California. I mean, and when LA was being built up, we had a period of heavy rains. So everything in LA was built to put the water out in the ocean. So we're trying to fix some of that, but whenever it rains, I'm about a mile as a crow flies from the ocean. I mean, there's just all the gutter water, it says, be careful, you know, this all drains to the ocean. It just goes straight into the ocean. We don't really have a way here of collecting that water. Okay, so that was a really big one. I thought it was completely under the radar until I read the Wall Street Journal article. So that would be huge. So like the trade unions, all the building constructions, they all love it. Some say this could be the most dramatic thing that President Trump has done during his presidency. So, I mean, but how many people really hear about that? They just hear about what's going on in Iran, impeachment, whatever. Now here's another small example. So I was reading this book, Groundbreaking America's New Quest for Mineral Independence, because I like to read stuff like this, but I'm just reading it about how we're really reliant on, I mean, people have heard about this for the rare earth minerals, you have to get them from China, but there's a lot of things that we're reliant on, and from other countries. So we basically stopped most mining during Bill Clinton's administration. And I thought, oh man, I worked in that administration. I didn't work in this area. But did we really even understand what we were doing? That was just, so I'm reading along going, another problem that we got to take care of. So it said, China's mineral industry plans are made easier by America's slide from the world's top minerals producing and exporter in the 1990s to the world's top importer of Chinese minerals today. The venerable U.S. Bureau of Mines was abolished in 1996. I had left by that time, not that I could have stopped it, during the Clinton administration, ostensibly for budgetary reasons. Now, America is the only global industrial superpower that does not have an agency specifically focused on mining. So I'm going, darn, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. And then I turned to this page. In fact, our nation's vulnerability to a potential mineral embargo, like if China did that to us, has become sufficiently serious that on December 20th, 2017, President Donald Trump issued an executive order to ensure secure and reliable supplies of critical minerals for the nation. Don't you just love our president? I mean, he's just doing so many smart things, paying attention. The Trump administration is committed to improved mineral policy stewardship, shorter permitting time, forming U.S. supply chains of technology, metals, and increasing mining-related GDP, taxes, and jobs for domestic mining. This strategy will enable the U.S. to compete with other industrial mining countries. I had no idea they were going to say anything about Trump in this book, but I love our president. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is an article that came out in Forbes January 2nd by Roger Pielke. Now, Roger Pielke is kind of an interesting case. I don't think he makes his arguments very well, to be honest, and I'm bugged that he still supports the Democrats after what they did to him. But I knew him from the fact that when there was first talk that climate change, global warming leads to extreme weather events, and that was what he studied at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I mean, he studied it. So even though he claims he's a believer in global warming, or whatever that means, he thought, no, I need to speak up because I think he was like the best person in the country to address this. I mean, this is his area. So he said, while there may be an increase in extreme weather events in the future, there has been none to date. And he was creamed. I remember in particular that he was really denigrated by Paul Krugman, whom up to that time, that was when I got the New York Times, I kind of liked him. But it was so mean, so baseless, I flipped on Paul Krugman. And now I'm like totally flipped on Paul Krugman. I mean, he's awful. He's an awful guy. At that same Kent Presents, he was sitting alone at a table, and Harold and I had a chance to talk to him. And so I said something like, you really, you're a smart guy. You really should look into climate change for yourself, because it's not good science. And he didn't say anything. But there were just three of us right there. Because it just struck me, when did he ever study climate? Why does he speak about it at all? Because he gave a talk during this Kent Presents, and I talked about this in my last video, what Kent Presents is. So I won't repeat what that is now. But he was talking about it, and somebody, it came up like, what is your day like? Like, what do you do? And so, he talked about, he writes his column, how he talks with other economists and reads some economic studies. Nothing about studying climate-related issues. Nothing for his whole day. It didn't even come up. So I thought, but how does that make you an authority to speak on this issue? You don't know diddly about it. You're just identifying with a team. So anyway, I have no respect for him. So the title of this article, How Billionaires, Tom Steyer, and Michael Bloomberg Corrupted Climate Science, by Roger Pielke, Jr. Now, it's kind of interesting because those two are still running for the Democratic nomination for president. I don't think, definitely Tom Steyer won't get it, and I have a hard time thinking that Bloomberg has a chance, except he's spending a lot of money, and at least he's been mayor, so he knows something about governance. So Roger Pielke's main point in investigating this, he said, even though he thinks climate change is real, I have long argued that maintaining scientific integrity should go hand in hand with effective climate action. According to the New York Times, in November 2012, 1 month after stepping down from the hedge fund he led, Steyer gathered environmental leaders and Democratic Party leaders around the kitchen table at his ranch in Pescadero, California. And I would say, this is me not reading this article, that it was around that time that I noticed a change in California, in the Democratic Party. And I did attribute it to Tom Steyer. Because what happened is he had so much money, and he basically said, I'm not going to fund any Democrat running for office in California or even on the national stage, but from California, unless they make climate change a big part of their agenda. See, prior to that, it was kind of like something you had to say you were for, but you didn't have to mention it. You didn't have to make it a big deal. But I think his money made a big difference, because around that time, 2012, 24, was when I was like, this isn't. And I remember talking to Harold, and Harold said, and I had read some other people say this. He said, this climate change thing, global warming thing will go away in another year or so, because it's not warming. You have this long hiatus. And after a while, people catch on. And I remember saying to him, Harold, there's something weird going on. It's like people are believing it more, even though there's less evidence for it. And this is the kind of thing that happened. But anyway, so he talks about all the people that were there, like Bill McGibbon, the founder of 350.org, and John Podesta, and you know who he is. But he had founded the Center for American Progress in 2003 to promote progressive causes. And he said, parenthetically, in 2014, Steyer funded a successful campaign by the Center for American Progress to have me removed as a writer for Nate Silver's 538, as revealed in the WikiLeaks Podesta emails. There was an orchestrated campaign to ruin Roger Pielke. And I'm like, why is he voting for these people in this party? I'm sorry, Roger Pielke, you're a little bit of a wimp, okay? At the kitchen table meeting, Tom Steyer, was focused on the question, how do you make climate change feel real and immediate for people? He was convinced by attendees that the best way to answer this question was through people's pocketbooks, through economics. So you also had there Mike Bloomberg and Hank Paulson. Remember, he was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs is a big player in this because they love all this, carbon credits and cap and trade, because that's just more money for them. So Goldman Sachs is not good. But he was also Secretary of the Treasury under George W. Bush. So he wasn't good on this issue either. So Steyer, Bloomberg, and Hank Paulson each contributed $500,000 to the initial project, which was focused on making the climate threat feel real, immediate, and potentially devastating to the business world. The initial aim was to produce a series of reports drawing on several young academics and the expertise of external consultants at the Rhodium Group and Risk Management Solutions. The first report was published in June 2014 and was titled, Risky Business, the Economic Risks of Climate Change in the United States. The risky business approach was he says smart because it worked, if flawed, meaning it wasn't methodologically correct in a science way, to place economics at the center of climate policy. So, and then he gets into the weeds here, which I think makes it a little bit less effective, and why people don't read this stuff, because he talks about the RCP 8.5 scenario. They used that, and it was terrible to use that scenario. And then he talks about why this had all these methodological mistakes that anybody with good scientific training should pick it out, or even economic training. And so I'm like, yeah, okay. So I read it, but you're not going to catch people's attention. Really what we're talking about is just screwing up our scientific community, our economic. They're just making them lose credibility. And it does make me mad, I admit. Not just admit, I'm really bugged about this. But here was another thing. it undertook a far more sophisticated campaign focused on introducing its methods into the mainstream scientific literature where they could take on a life of their own. For instance, soon after the initial risky business report was released in 2014, the Steyer, Bloomberg, Paulson-funded work was the basis for 11 talks at the annual meeting of the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco, which is the largest annual gathering of climate researchers. And then they talked about how it got, he goes on and on about how it got published in the scientific literature, and it even served as a basis for the authoritative scientific reviews, such as the U.S. National Climate Assessment. And there was a 2016 paper published in the prestigious journal Science, and I talked about Science magazine and why I won't subscribe to it. And you may have heard about this, because actually even Scott Adams talked about it, about why that wouldn't be a problem. But in his case, he's saying this was the most extreme possibility. The most extreme conclusion of this analysis was that the United States would see a 10% hit to its economy, like way in the future, like in 2099. Because the 10% GDP loss figure would become the top line conclusion of the U.S. National Climate Assessment the next year. So he's saying, first of all, this was like totally bogus as it was in any event. But even if you accepted that, big deal, okay? If you have this huge economy looking way off in the future for something you do now, you get a 10% hit, it's nothing. First of all, if you start with a big baseline, a 10% hit later is not that bad. It's nothing. And that's what Scott Adams talked about when he said, who cares? But, there were all these supposedly scary headlines. So he goes on and on about how this gets weaved into everything. But here's the thing. And also how it was shady, how people who worked on this and were getting paid by these people were actually then the ones that wrote the papers. It's just so incestuous, so disgusting. However, here's what I love. And you almost have to laugh. Whose economy is really doing well? The U.S. economy, under President Trump's policies, is doing so well. There's no other country that's doing as well as we are. Europe isn't doing very well, and they've got all this green stuff. Canada's not doing well. All those ones that have adopted these climate change policies, their economies are hurting. Their electricity costs are high. We have some of those same problems in California, but we're riding on earlier successes. They will eventually come home to roost. But, all countries have to do is look what they're doing in the U.S. And our economy's doing fabulous. So are they saying that we should ruin our economy? You see, one of the problems I find, and this is true for a lot of scientists that don't go with all this extremist and crazy world is ending nonsense, is they all talk so tamely, kind of like Roger Pielke, here's how he ends it. The corruption of climate science has occurred because some of our most important institutions have let us down. The scientific peer review process has failed to catch obvious methodological errors in research papers. Leading scientific assessments have ignored conflicts of interest and adopted flawed methods. The media has been selectively incurious as to the impact of big money on climate advocacy. Well, yeah, because the media, the mainstream media, they have said, I remember the LA Times, long ago said, we will not publish letters to the editor that are skeptical of climate change. Chuck Todd, a long time ago, said, well, we will never have a speaker on his, whatever his program is, Face the Nation, I don't know what it's called, who isn't a believer in climate change. So, of course, the media, it's not that they're selectively incurious. You see this tame language? You know, this is a story of how wealth and power have corrupted science in pursuit of political goals. And he says, climate change is important. Oh yeah? How do you know? Based on what? Because this has gone on for all of the studies from the get-go. I've read so many things. If you look into the origins of it, it's shocking how bad the science is and how it gets corrupted this way. Climate change is important, there is no doubt. So maybe he's trying to establish his bona fides in this other group. But it doesn't work that way. They will still attack you, okay? Don't try to placate these people. They will still attack you if you don't go 100% on board. But the importance of climate change does not mean that we should abandon high standards of scientific integrity. Anyway, if someone wants to read this, I will pin an attachment so you can read it. The reason it's interesting is because there's a lot of highlighted links, so you can read more. And I did read some of these. So I'm looking at the clock. So let me close with this. In regard to what's going on with Iran, and you know, I totally support the president. I mean, think about it. He's not killing soldiers, it's a drone strike. Right on the bad guy. I mean, it's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. But when they passed this, like, war resolutions, whatever act it was in the House, I did not like Matt Gaetz saying he's going to vote with it. Because he needs to consider, in my view. Now, let me just say, Scott Adams, I was watching him and he said, oh, that was low-hanging fruit. Great thing for him to do. No, it wasn't. Because he's going to the side of the other team. Like Mike Lee in the Senate getting all mad about it. I don't like him at all. Okay? Because that's just used by the other side. Like, ooh, look, we got this person, right? How many Democrats do they allow on the Democratic side to break ranks? They don't. You break ranks, whether it be Tulsi Gabbard, whether it be that one guy who changed parties, you break ranks, you're out. You are out. And I thought that was not good for Matt Gaetz. You know, he said, oh, it was toothless, you know, they can't really do anything. It's like, well, don't do it right then. If you want to vote for some war powers resolution, don't do it in the midst of attacks on Trump. Just do it another time. Because that's clearly what this was about. That's clearly what this was about. We're a team. You've got to be on this team. You know, like listening to Dan Crenshaw. He was fabulous. By the way, one of my Democratic friends, I was talking about who could come in 2024. And I mentioned some Republicans. And he said, I think Dan Crenshaw's pretty good. So he could appeal to a lot of people. But I liked what he said. It's like, no way. Okay? So Matt Gaetz, another thing Matt Gaetz once said, yeah, there is some climate change. And I was bothered about that. So I really like how Matt Gaetz has stood up for our president, but I don't like him for those two things. I don't think, I don't respect him for that. You're just providing fodder to the other side. And things are so bad now. Yeah, it is kind of a war, and we're a team. Like, don't go helping the other side. Sorry, period. I'm actually going to be just under 30 minutes. I have my niece visiting. We've been having a lot of fun. We went to the beach yesterday. She went to the beach with me and Robert, my stepson. And it was just fun. It's fun having her here. Bye now.